because your name is Monique or your name is Lavon or Shaniqua that you're African American and you're not qualified because your name has an ethnicity to it.
I know this girl, her name is Treasure, Trezure. Struck me as typically, more African American name.
Between names for white people and names for black people.
Black names be like Malik, Jaquan, Nashawn, Naheem.
Using data that covers every child born in California over a period of 4 decades, Dr. Mullainathan and Roland Fryer made an analysis of first names and found the differences between black and white name choices in recent years. More than 40% of the African American girls born in California in recent years had names that were unheard of for an estimated 100,000 white girls born in the same state. Even among popular names, racial patterns are distinct. Names such as Precious, Kiara, and Deja are popular among blacks as opposed to the typical white names Connor, Emily, Abigail, and Caitlin. Such names have raised questions on whether or not these children are being affected in society when it comes to fitting in. Research shows that most of these distinctive names usually come from single black mothers or are influenced by a racially isolated community. African Americans who lived in a white neighborhood often named their children according to some of these white names. This shows how the environment a person lives in influences the names one might give to their child.
Cultural segregation, the gap between white culture and black culture.
One embodiment of that culture is what you name your kid. It's probably one of the few cultural items that we can really measure precisely. What we did was we looked at the effects of your kid's first name on their life outcomes.
Dr. Fryer analyzed the naming records of every baby born in the state of California over the last 40 years, and those names tell an unmistakable story. African American parents are more likely than any other ethnic group to give their children unique names.
In an article, the Preschool Children's Selection of Race-Related Personal Names, which is published in the Journal of Black Studies, shows how many names not only provide a sense of identity, but also may connect a person to their culture, social class, religious affiliation, and background. Names are often chosen based on beliefs, institutionalized norms, and/or economic status. In the 1960s, blacks and whites chose relatively similar first names for their children. Over a short period of time in the early 1970s, however, that pattern changed dramatically, with most blacks, particularly those living in racially isolated neighborhoods, adopting increasingly distinctive names, with only a small number of blacks actually moving toward more assimilating names. The patterns in the data appear most consistent with a model in which the rise of the Black Power movement influenced how blacks perceived their identities. Among blacks born in the last 2 decades, names provide a strong symbol of socioeconomic status, which was not previously the case.
It was actually in the 50s and the early 60s that we saw huge overlaps in the naming patterns of blacks and whites. So people, naming their kids John, Michael, names like that. And what you saw was around in the 1968 or so, kind of the Black Power movement actually, you saw distinct bifurcation with black names getting more distinctively black, and a lot of them were Islamic names. Because the Black Power movement was about identity. Who are we? Who are you? Are you part of us? It wasn't until the late 80s and 90s that we started to get, kind of the made-up, concatenated names that you see now.
What we did is we made up 5,000 resumes. Half of them we put an African-American name, half of them we put a white name. Otherwise, the resumes were the same. And we sent them out. And then we said, which got called back more? And what we found was that the same resume, when it had an African-American name, was about 33% less likely to get an interview than when it had a white name. It means that if a white person is searching for a job for 10 weeks, an equivalently skilled African-American person would be searching for 15 weeks.
In the article Racial Bias in Hiring by Marianne Bertrand, Bertrand conducted an experiment to see if there was a significant amount of racial bias when prospective employees apply. She created 4 names: Emily Walsh, Brendan Baker, Lakeisha Washington, and Jamal Jones. Using these names, Bertrand sent out several employment applications, recording her findings. Overall, she found that 50% of people with white-sounding names were most likely to get an interview than those with African-American sounding names. She also found that while Emily and Brendan needed to send 10 resumes to get at least one callback, Lakeisha and Jamal needed to send out 15. In other words, it was very hard for Lakeisha and Jamal to attain a callback, the first step towards employment. Through her research, she also found that although one African American candidate had a better resume than his or her white counterpart, the company nearly always accepted the white candidate.
I'm an African American parent. I'm thinking of naming my child. Tyrone sounds like a very good name. I might have had a grandfather named Tyrone. Should I name my child Tyrone? Yes, naming your kid Tyrone, you have made it harder for them in the labor market. On the other hand, should you give in to that? Should I give in to the prevailing norms, or should I express my individuality as I want? It's a bit of an ethical quandary.
In the article, The Long-Term Consequences of a Distinctively Black Name shows how people with different African American names are affected not only by employment options and interviews, but also by colleges and people around them as well. For example, some college professors do not consider to meet with a person about discussing the next step, such as graduate school or a research project, as opposed to someone with a white name. Research also shows that teachers have lower expectations for those with distinctive names, mainly based on how low the general African American test scores are, which include the SAT, the ACT, and the STAR testings, as well as APs, etc. Accordingly, many people view names that are hard to pronounce negatively. The easier it is to pronounce a name, the better chances you have.
The people who end up with very black names are treated very differently. We know that in the data, African Americans earn a lot less. And we're interested in how much of that earning less is simply because they find it harder to get a job, and are African Americans treated very differently in the labor market than white.
The Journal of Black Studies, which published an article called Preschool Children's Selection of Race-Related Personal Names, shows how distinct African American names not only affect individuals as adults trying to obtain jobs in the American workforce, but affects them emotionally as children as well. The article is based on an experiment that studied several children enrolled in Head Start, a preschool for lower-income families, with typical white and African names. They were divided. It closely examines how children with stereotypical black names react according to their names. The black stereotype is the black people, usually with ghetto or black names, are more likely to end up in jail for theft, murder, violence, etc., and therefore these children feel like they are expected to live up to the expectation. The white children then demonstrated that black people are often portrayed to be the bad guys in the media, and therefore expect their peers with such qualities to do the same. What are your thoughts on African American names?
I think they're very unique. You know, even if you're reading it on a paper or something, it's easy to point out if the person's black by their name, even though sometimes you might be shocked that it's not really a black person, but they're easy to pinpoint, especially like Deshaun or just different things. And a lot in the media, there's also a lot of things that people do make fun of African American names, and I think that they're super easy to figure out.
Do you think your name could affect your future in the long run, like when it comes to getting jobs or interviews?
I definitely think it does, because the people who do have those unique black names probably aren't taken as seriously as someone whose name's John or